The salvation paradigm looks back into the Old Testament. Now, again, the salvation paradigm has been embraced by a people that have already been declared righteous and are in right standing with God. Now, because of that, the salvation paradigm, because it's not intended for the New Testament, it will go back into the Old Testament to try to justify its position for the New Testament member or the church who has been made righteous. Again, the paradigm has a contrary perspective than the audience that is actually trying to serve. Its perspective is from the position of somebody who is not in right standing with God. Therefore, it has to teach that the law and works are contrary to your position with God. Well, it of course will have that perspective because it is intended for those who don't have a covenant with God. However, in the kingdom paradigm, which is the church, the kingdom paradigm, law and works are not a means of earning or meritoriously gaining the favor and the blessing of God, because you already have those things as a result of you having received God's grace in Jesus Christ by faith. You have already been born again and declared righteous. Therefore, law and works do not have the same perspective. But because it is being misapplied to a audience that no longer has that same perspective, it has to create a situation or circumstances in which it is reinforced, or the paradigm is sustained, its integrity is sustained by misapplying or misinterpreting the Old Testament. It's very strange because it avoids the Old Testament as a reference, but at the same time, it will reference the Old Testament as a mean to justify its application to the New Testament church. Because the letters of Paul, when you're looking at Paul, Paul is answering salvation paradigms questions. He's answering the question, what is the assurance of my salvation, the basis of my salvation, the basics of my salvation, and Christ as the source of my salvation. The reason why he's doing that is because there are legalists, those who are abusing the law and using it or trying to impose it for means it was never given for, as an addition and necessary work for someone to be saved. And of course, the salvation paradigm, and Paul being a salvation paradigm teacher for the Gentiles to become saved, he's going to have a strict prohibition against that revelation or that perspective being applied to the church. Because the church has already received, or the basis upon which one is accepted by God is God's grace, is faith in Jesus Christ. But again, it's telling us how to get in the church. Now that you're already in the church, Paul would agree that the law of God is good. He would agree that above all, keep the commandments, 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse number 19. So we see that even Paul kept the law. You look in Acts chapter 15, or I believe it's Acts chapter 21, where the apostles actually tell him, go to the temple so that the people will know that you yourself observe or keep the law. And Paul did it because he knew it wasn't for righteousness' sake, that issue was settled by the work of Jesus Christ and by the grace of God. However, the law in the life of somebody who has a covenant with God is for the manifestation of God's blessing in their life and in the world. And as a result of that, the cultivation of heaven's culture here on earth. Now, that's the perspective that we have of law and works in the New Testament and from a kingdom perspective. But the salvation paradigm, again, primarily focuses on how do I legally come into possession of the blessing of God. If I were to summarize it, that's the issue in the salvation paradigm. The issue, because the salvation paradigm focuses on what? The assurance, the basis, and the basics in Christ as a source of your salvation. That is how you legally become a child of God. So it focuses on how do I legally come into possession of the promises and the blessing of God. In the kingdom paradigm, the issue is different. It is not how do I legally acquire these things. Why? Because you already have acquired these things. The issue now becomes how do I literally manifest what I have legally become a possessor of. And that's where the law and works come into play. The law, from a Hebraic standpoint, and it's understood by Jews, is instructions. The primary translation or interpretation of the word Torah or law from a Jewish perspective is instructions. The reason why, it is instructions on how to develop the character of God, the character of a citizen of heaven, and how to manifest the culture of heaven here on earth. It's instructions. It tells you how to manifest those things on earth and in your life. It is also, when you look at it from that perspective, the kingdom paradigm, looking at works, works are the means by which you literally manifest those promises in your life. So law and works in the kingdom paradigm speak of the literal, how do I literally manifest? What the salvation paradigm focuses on, how you come into legal possession of those blessings and the promises of God. So do you see the difference? Salvation paradigm is focused on the legal, how do I legally come into possession of what it is that I desire, the promises and the blessings of God. How does that legally happen? Well, the letters of Paul and the salvation paradigm message is focused on the assurance, the basis, the basics, and Christ as a source of your salvation, right standing with God. That's how you legally come into possession of those things. You have to receive those things by grace and faith. Now that I'm already saved, now I'm in the kingdom paradigm. Now I have to, my focus is the literal manifestation of those things in the world, or the work of ministry, or the work, the good works that Paul says that have been given to us from the foundation of the world. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, or John chapter 14, verse number 12. Greater works will you do. Why? Because it's not talking about how do I come into the legal possession of these things, promises and blessing of God. How do I become right with God? You already are right in the kingdom paradigm. Now my issue is, how do I literally manifest those promises and blessing in my life, which the law will function as instructions for you, and works will be the means by which you manifest them in this world. So this is why that is so important to understand. Now, what I want to do is go more directly to what we were talking about in the previous section, where I talked about that there are two main issues that we want to sort out. First is the manner of acceptance and qualification for the benefits are different between a covenant and a contract, and how the issue of consideration removes us from ever having a contract, or the possibility of God dealing with man on contract principles or basis. Now, the first thing that we have to recognize, and I mentioned this earlier, that a contract is performance based, and a covenant is based on being confirmed. This is why when you hear somebody talking about, who's in the church, who's talking about, they may even be pointing back to the old covenant, and they say that in order for you to get good, you had to be good, or you had to obey in order for this to happen, or you had to do this. And they're even talking about back in the Old Testament. It's incorrect, because again, God dealt with his people in the Old Testament on the basis of covenant. The law was given not as a basis by which you come in the right standing with God, or you receive from God. It was a means by which you enjoyed, or you manifested what you already received as a result of your covenant with God. And so again, a contract, they're using contract principles to describe a covenant. The covenant that the nation of Israel had, again, with God was not based on their obedience. It was based on their confirmation that took place in Exodus chapter 19, or Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20, they agreed to become a nation, a holy people unto God, a nation of priests, a kingdom of priests. Later on, then came the law of Moses, but it came after they had agreed to be family of God. And actually, their covenant was found all the way back in Abraham. This is why God in Exodus chapter 4, verse number 22 and 23 could refer to Israel before he even offered them the commandments. as being his son, his eldest son. Why? Because God had a covenant with their father Abraham. So a covenant is based on confirmation, not performance. When we look back and we hear the church today talking about do good to get good, they had to obey in order for this, and when they disobeyed, God did this. What you saw was the only time God allowed people to die as a result of disobedience was when it directly impacted the covenant. Example, when the people built that golden calf, the nation of Israel built a golden calf when Moses was up on the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments. What happened? They declared that this was their God and that this golden calf, this idol, had delivered them from Egypt. What did they do? They directly violated the covenant that God had with them. They rejected God as their God, and they entered into covenant with this golden calf. As a result, the covenant was broken. And when the covenant was broken, they were no longer God's people. Those individuals that participated in it and did not repent, they were no longer God's people. And as a result of that, God dealt with them as strangers. How do we know this? Well, when Moses came down, he saw the people had done this. He told them, those who are on the Lord's side, come to me. And those who don't repent, you stay right there. And guess what happened? Over 99.9% of the people that had engaged in that conduct repented and reaffirmed their covenant with God. The reason why we know this is that the Bible tells us, if we do the numbers of strangers and the nation of Israel who came out of Egypt, if we do the numbers, it was almost 2 million people. Some people estimate close to 3 million people. Well, the Bible tells us that only 3,000 died by the sword at the foot of the mountain. Well, what happened to the other 99.9%? They didn't die by the sword because they repented of their sin and they reconfirmed their covenant with God. So God dealt with those who did not want a covenant with him as strangers and slew them or Moses and the Levites slew them at the foot of the mountain. And then what do we see? The very next chapter, God calls Moses up and tells him what? I'm going to give you the commandments again. Since the people broke the commandments and likewise you dropped the tablets that I gave you, we're going to do this all over again. Why? Because it was a covenant of law. It wasn't a covenant of works. It was a covenant of law. It was God's order. And so God was not dealing with them based on their conduct. He was dealing with them on the basis of the presence of a covenant. And so we see that even when we look back into the Old Testament, and if we use eyes that are using contract principles, it destroys the principle upon which God was dealing with his people, which is covenant, and it gives us the faulty understanding of God's nature, that God requires for us to do something first and then he reciprocates with his goodness. That's a contract basis, and that's a contract principle, and we're going to see that it has no founding in God's covenants. And so when you look at that, when we talk about a contract basis, it's based on performance. Again, a covenant is based on being confirmed. Once you confirm the covenant, the blessings and the promises and the benefits of that covenant become yours. Contract basis, you must perfectly perform the requirements in order for you to have a right to something. So in the contract today, think about it. You enter into a contract, they say, okay, I will pay you $1,000 if you cut the lawn for the entire year. You enter into a contract for lawn service, $1,000 to cut the lawn. What do you have to do in order for you to receive the $1,000? You have to cut the lawn every week for that year if it was on a weekly basis. Say if you bought something or you engaged in some form of contract for services. Say that somebody's going to build your house, and your house has to be paid for, and the cost for the house is $500,000. What if at some point you say, do you know what? I can't afford $500,000. All I can afford is $250,000. Guess what the other people have a right to do? Stop building your house. Why? Because you haven't performed. You will not be able to perfectly and totally perform your end of the bargain. Therefore, they don't have to perform. That's a contract. Look at the situation in the wilderness with the nation of Israel. Over the next 40 years, they continually do not trust in God and disobey Him. But guess what God has to continually do? Feed them with bread from heaven. He has to give them water from a rock. He keeps them healthy. He covers them from the sun with a cloud by day. He keeps things warm, room temperature, with being a ball of fire by night. He guides them through the wilderness. He's with them the entire time. And in the book of Exodus, God says, this is how you will know that my grace is with you, that I will be in the midst of your people in the form of a cloud and by a pillar of fire. So when they saw the pillar of fire and the cloud by day, they knew that they were being dealt with by a principle or a covenant of grace, not of works. But it was a covenant that is premised on law. Do you see the difference between even the meaning of the words works and law, and how God dealt with them on a covenant basis and not on a contract basis? If it was a contract basis, as I mentioned before, they would have died of thirst and hunger in the wilderness, because God would have no longer been obliged to be good to them. So we have to keep that in mind. Again, contracts are based on performance. So when we hear people talking today about obey in order to be blessed, you had to perfectly perform all of the laws of Moses in order for God to do this, or you had to do that. They have converted God's covenant into a contract. It is true that they were required to offer sacrifices for sin. It is true that God required them to conduct themselves in a certain way, but it was not to maintain their relationship with God or to be blessed by God. The covenant of God did that. What those sacrifices did and what those requirements did, it reminded the people that their culture of the culture of the kingdom that they had become citizens of was much higher than what they had become accustomed to. And it was cultivating in their mind as well as in their community through practice a higher standard of living. Even the dietary laws, the prohibitions, all those types of things, though those weren't rules for rules' sake. Those were rules to cultivate a level of health and living in the community of Israel that was unheard of on earth. It was to, in all purposes and intent, to the highest degree, cultivate heaven's culture or reproduce heaven's culture or manifest heaven's culture in the people's bodies, in their relationships, and in the communities. That's why the law was given. So, of course, when sin showed up, we could not allow sin to just propagate and to grow. There had to be an atonement. And because there literally was nothing that could literally atone for sin, they had to do things that represented what would eventually atone for sin. So it was not based on contract principles, but covenant. Secondly, consideration. When you're talking about consideration, consideration is necessary for there to be a legal contract. So when you apply contract principles of God, it is incompatible, it's incongruent, it's an impossibility because of the issue of consideration. Consideration is value given to the promisor. And again, it must diminish the giver and it must increase the recipient of the consideration. Well, right away, we have a problem when we relate that to God, because God never requires us to give first before He will do something that He desires for us. God is our source. So anything that God requires of us, He must first give it to us. Another qualification for consideration is this, that it cannot be already owned or owed to the promisor. So again, what are you going to give God as consideration to support a contract that doesn't already belong to Him, is owned by Him, or is owed by Him? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. The cattle on 1,000 hills, the gold and silver is His, the stars and the sun and the solar systems, they belong to Him. There is nothing that does not belong to God, so you can't give Him something for consideration to support a contract that doesn't already belong to Him. And again, I mentioned this in the previous lesson. Some might say, well, you know, I'll give him my praise and worship. Well, you can't even do that. They would mention that's a free will offering. Well, you can't even do that because it's already owed him. Your worship and praise of God is due. The breath you just took is due to him blessing you with it. So you owe him worship and praise because of that. He is worthy to be praised because of who he is. If he didn't do anything for you, but because he has to do everything for you, then the praise is due. He's worthy of worship because who he is. So right then and there, your worship wouldn't qualify as consideration. Your praise is due because of what he has done. So right there, your praise wouldn't even qualify as consideration. So when we look at it, we see that the contract perspective of God's dealing with his people, even from an Old Testament standpoint, falls apart. Now, why is this important? It's important because when we're talking about the will of God and we're talking about the New Testament church's position, the law and works are provision given to the church again to manifest the will of God in the earth again, to manifest it. The reason why we use the word manifest is because the salvation paradigm is concerned with how we legally come into possession of the promises and blessing of God. And therefore, law and works have no place in that conversation and are rightfully resisted. However, when we get to the New Testament, as Paul stated, we were created for good works. And these works, good works, have been given to us from the foundation of the world. As Jesus stated, greater works we are intended to do than he did. Well, from a salvation paradigm, the work was finished on the cross. But Jesus could say also, greater works will you do, because the works that he perfected on the cross are not the works that he is committing to us as a result of the cross. The works that he did on the cross are salvific and redemptive in nature, and only he could do those works. Once he did those works on our behalf, they were finished. Once we enter into the kingdom paradigm, however, there is works that are necessary for us to do that have been given to us, Ephesians chapter 2, from the foundation of the world, that if we use a salvation paradigm understanding of law and works, these works of manifesting what we have legally come into possession as a result of the salvation paradigm, in the kingdom paradigm, those works become frustrated because now the church adopting a salvation paradigm is opposed to doing those works because they believe somehow it's abrasive to the grace and faith of Jesus Christ, because that is what? A salvation paradigm understanding. This is why the church is losing its influence in the world today, because it's not doing the work of the kingdom, which necessarily concerns addressing the systems of the world, while the salvation paradigm addresses the souls of men. Again, the salvation paradigm addresses the souls of men, while the kingdom paradigm addresses the systems of the world. So if the church has a salvation paradigm mindset, it's going to resist law and works because that is repulsive to the grace and faith in Jesus Christ for the salvation of our souls. However, us being kingdom paradigm have to adopt a kingdom paradigm perspective of both law and works so that we can address the system that is in the world so that it can so that we could manifest God's heavenly kingdom here on earth, and he's going to use us to do it. And this is why Paul declared that those good works have been committed to us from the foundation of the world. And Jesus said that greater works you will do as you address this world system. I'm going to the Father bodily, but I still have my body here on earth, and these works have been committed to you because of the work that I finished on the cross for your right standing and for your righteousness with God. So hopefully this has answered some of those questions that maybe were outstanding even after the teaching that I previously did on covenants and contracts. And I pray that this has given us a greater appreciation for the Old Testament, even as a result of it giving us principles on how to operate even in the New Testament. Yes, there is a difference between the Old and New Covenant. The Old Covenant and the New Covenant, they share the same substance, while at the same time they do differ in their administration. The principles that we find in the Old Testament, They are the same as the ones by which we have to receive and operate in the New Testament. The substance of those covenants is the faithfulness of God. The administration is different, where we had types and shadows in the Old Testament, and we literally had the person and the substance of the person Jesus Christ as our administrator in the New Testament. And therefore, these are better promises in the sense in the New Testament than we have in the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament they were representative of what Christ actually did in the New Testament. But the principles are the same. And this is why we have to necessarily understand that we can't apply contract principles to what is actually a covenant, because it changes God's character and also handicaps the church in its work in this world.